What a great pleasure it is for me to introduce Sara Cobb. Personally and professionally, I've known Sara for, I think, almost 40 years. She was in the roots of developing constructionist theory, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. I think the last time we saw each other may have been you were directing a program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School and asked me for a visit. It was lovely. So I'm very anxious to catch up on things. You went on from there to the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason, where you were the director of a special program on the study of narrative and conflict resolution. So that work has continued and grown. I'd love to see this book. You're on violence, speaking of violence, politics and poetics of narrative and conflict resolution. Very important work. What I think is most significant about Sara from the very beginning is as constructionist ideas were beginning to emerge, she was the first, one of the first to see that the idea of narrative, which a sort of linchpin in the way we construct our lives, made a huge difference in terms of the possibilities for conflict resolution, the creation and resolution of conflict, and has pursued that and developed it, and I think become perhaps the world's most important figure in terms of applying narrative theory to issues of conflict. So Sara, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Ken, and really thanks to the Taos Institute and to all the organizers, Alex, and appreciate Sheila being here today as well. It's just a wonderful opportunity. I love this idea of pulsating practices. It's a good idea because practices should be pulsating, as in alive, as in, changing and growing. So
Sara, could I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
And just invite everyone as the morning or the time passes, feel free to place a comment or a question in the chat and I'll monitor that and we can keep it more dialogic in that way. Sorry, Sara.
That's no problem. It's really fun here to be here as well because my connection to Sheila and Ken is, as Ken was, saying. I mean, I met Ken probably 40 years ago in my PhD program, and he came to my university and gave some talks, and I was like, with read The Transformation of Social Knowledge. I think it was published back in 1980, and it just followed your work all these years, Ken. And Sheila and I have been really the spawn, let's say, of the folks at UMass Amherst with coordinated management of meaning theory. And both of us cut our teeth on that and were there and went in different directions, but, stayed connected to these ideas, and her work on relational responsibility was just super important to me, and to my students as well. So it's sort of a wonderful interconnection here to be with these people who've meant so much to me in my own life, to be here sharing ideas and hanging out together. It's a lot of fun. So I thought we'd do today is I've got some ideas I wanted to share, and really a description of this practice I've started doing, and sort of to try it out on you and see what you think. I'm interested in your ideas. I thought if we, what I'd like to do is then actually see it in action, and maybe we could get a couple of people from the group to model for us a conversation that we're having, and I'd be there to, of course, add my 2 cents and hang out with the two people who are doing this conversation. And then we can sort of step back as a broader group and reflect and think about, make comments and think about how this makes sense if it does. So I see something that's sort of basically some blah, blah, blah ideas and some slides, then some real engagement and practice, and then some commentary and questions and discussion, as Sheila was saying, some dialogue back and forth. So keep putting things in the chat, and we'll that's how we go. And if that makes sense to folks, then I'd go ahead and get started with some slides that I put together to describe this practice. So Alex, can I have those? And by the way, I'm happy to share these slides. I don't have any problem with sharing them. So I've been interested in intra-group process, not intergroup. I did a lot of work intergroup in my career, but I really am interested in intra-group at this point. And there's a reason for that. And it has to do with, we have all these Asian processes, negotiation and mediation, the Asians, I call them, for bringing people together. The problem is that the narratives on which those conversations are based are extremely problematic. So we see the research, at least in the field of conflict resolution, something like 80% of peace agreements fail after 5 years, if they were ever done in the first place. And the reason, I think, is that they're built on very problematic stories that end up recolonizing the space and overshadowing and destroying even the conflict resolution possibilities. So I really am in favor of intra, and I think it's just a fabulous place to work. Second comment I want to make, sort of generic, is that the field of narrative has been hijacked by people doing so-called narrative campaigns, people doing lots of narrative strategy. I've worked with the US military. I work with NGOs that want to, fight fascism. And all of these groups are interested in basically winning what's called the battle of the narrative. And so they want their narrative to win. And so the strategy is all about how do you replace or implant or destroy or get rid of narratives that you don't like, so yours wins, right? And I think it's a very, very problematic approach to narrative work. And so this is not that. Even though the word strategy is in the title, it is a strategy because I've got some theory of practice, basically strategy as theory of practice. I have a theory of practice for how narratives change, and that's why I'm calling it a strategy, not because we're out to win anything. Can I have the next slide? So the first thing I want to, I want to lay some groundwork here is that, narrative is really it's an architecture of meaning, right? And it's the architecture from meaning and action, both. And, we're built, we're homo neurons, we're built to tell stories. It's ubiquitous and it crosses all culture. And there's a lot of theory about, well, what is a narrative and how is it composed? And for me, it's kind of got like 3 core parts. You've got plot sequences, which is, the logic of what happened. People are telling a story about that provides a logic of what happened and how it's connected to an outcome. That's a plot line. And they have values, which is moral frameworks that people are using to judge their own actions and others people's as well. And of course, the way that judgment goes in a conflict is, I'm fabulous, you're terrible, right? So the value systems are all designed to support, what we would call a positive position for self inside of that discourse, right? I'm thinking of Ram Haray's work there, and a negative position for the other in a conflict. But the character in my little design here, the character is the biggest gear. And that's because, unlike Aristotle, who said the most important thing of a narrative is the plot, Hegel came along and said, nope, it's really about the character. It's about the people. And I'm totally in agreement with that. That the purpose of the story, the purpose of storytelling in general, is this location in a moral framework, is this people saying, I'm a good person, here's the way I'm a good person. And all these other people are bad people. So particularly in a conflict. So the character and how people are framing themselves and describing themselves and others is where it's all at. And I would that's why I've got plot and values in service to this most important feature. Because one could say, I think, and I have, and many other people besides me, is that conflict is a function of delegitimization. In other words, folks that are denigrated and let's say despised and delegitimized are struggling for legitimacy. That's what conflict is. Folks struggling for legitimacy. And And as Martha Nussbaum and other people have said, hey, you know, we're not just able to stand up and say we're moral, I'm a good person. You, as other people around me, have to say I'm a good person. It's not enough for me to say I'm a good person. I have to enroll you in a story that frames me as a good enough person. So so we're dependent on each other for these descriptions, and that's really what all this is about. So can I have the next slide? Today I want to talk a little bit about master narratives. So that's sort of the general narrative framework. The arc. Oh, can you go back to the slide? I forgot my most important point. Okay, this is a closed system. In other words, it's a system that is not terribly open to evolution, to changes, particularly in the case of a conflict. Now, if Sheila and I sit down for a conversation and, you know, we're friends and we are not in conflict, and the story that we're telling about we could ask each other, you know, how over the last 40 years have we, has our notion of social constructionism shifted? It'd be a wonderful story with lots of evolution, and it'd be very open, and I would add something and she would incorporate that, and vice versa. But we're not in conflict. When people are in conflict, the narrative systems are incredibly closed. If you look at the Middle East conflict, for instance, or the war in Ukraine, or what we've got going on in the United States right now, between the right and the left, these are closed systems. They don't let in a light. They are interested in maintaining their own formulations. Now, notice that I put the accent not on the people who are telling the stories. I'm talking about narratives as protean living things that are interested in survival and in maintaining their own coherence. So the coherence is a function of this closed system. And can I have the next slide? That's a really important point that I wanted to make. Now, these, as narratives, let's say, gain momentum in the public sphere, you see them, you know, they become master narratives, and whether they're, you know, gendered stories about the role of a woman, that's a master narrative that really impacted my life, as I was born in the 50s, right? And women were supposed to just grow up and have babies and take care of children, right? That's a big story. Grow up and get married, I might say. I forgot that part. And then have children. Anyway, all of our lives are guided by these big master narratives, of course. And we have examples of them here just described, just depicted here, that, you know, we've got line of police that are in DC, as the police and the military have been occupied DC for a portion of time recently. You've got big narratives about what immigrants should or shouldn't be doing here, and what do we have to do about that. We've got master narratives about climate and what we can do to how, let's say, what's caused climate change and what can we do about it. We've got the Make America Great Again big story. That's a big narrative, and then there's a master narrative on the other side of that, right? And then we have master narratives like, for instance, religious narratives, which are designed not to separate us or to generate conflict, but to bring us together. Stories about communion, stories of community and connection. So, and those can be master narratives as well. But my point is that they have their own coherence, their own structure, and the more frequently they're told, the simpler they get. So the big problem for, you know, big public conflicts like the ones we have now, for instance, in the United States between the right and the left, is that the more these stories are repeated, the more rigid they become and the simpler they get. Can I have a next slide? So as they become simpler, this is, you know, the language of Gilles Deleuze. As they become simpler, what we could call lines of force, which is the sort of the grid lines along which people can talk, become even more rigid and even more enforced. So if you think of a discursive field as having, you know, it's not like we can just say anything. We can't just say anything. We are instructed about what kinds of things we can say and what sort of stories can be told by these master narratives, for instance. So, would it be hard for a woman from 1950 to talk about wanting a career? Yes, that would have been a breach or against the lines of force for the gender narratives that were in place, when I was coming along. But the same is true now on the Democrat side. If you talk to Democrats in the United States, well, there's things that can't be said about, for instance, people's concern for immigration, people that might be on the Democrat side concerned for too many quote unquote illegal immigrants coming to the United States. They can't talk about that, not on the Democrat side. Or maybe there are people on the right that actually are concerned that women should have a choice for whether or not they have an abortion. But they can't talk about that, not in their families, not in their business, not in their homes, not in, they can't speak that thing. So what I'm trying to say is that these lines of force are regulated not only by the narratives that are being told, but about the coalitions that are formed around those narratives. And then there's like policing going on, as Rancière said, Jacques Rancière, he wrote a wonderful book called Dissensus, and he argues in there about the way in which these narrative systems, discourse systems are policed. And I just tell a quick story. After Trump was first elected in 2016, I decided to interview folks who were in hate groups. And I just would, I wanted to, there were 964 of them, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center in the United States. So I set about to interview them. And I'm telling you, my faculty colleagues, my provost, my husband, my kids, nobody wanted me to talk to those people. That's an example of the way in which the master narratives in my community about people who would be fascist or part of hate groups, that's the way in which they policed me or tried to not talk about things. So I want to show that it's not that the bad guys restrict what can be said. Narratives restrict what can be said and who we can say them to. So we have to sort of think about the problem that narratives present for all of us, having to do with the way in which they restrict our learning, and they reduce their own evolution, or they reduce the possibility of the evolution of the stories themselves. Can I have a next slide? So if we look at the stories that people are telling, right, they're also deeply, deeply emotional, and they're tied to, the limbic brain, and whether or not, I read this book by Sapolsky called Determined. It's a fabulous book, and it basically argues there's no free will. And he doesn't talk about language, and I wrote him a letter and scolded him a little bit about that. I don't know why he doesn't talk about language. It's not his thing, because he's talking about neurological processes. But basically, there are these pathways that are laid down, and I think of them as narrative pathways in the brain about how the stories are organized, and they are generative of more of the same, right? They're not generative of opening. They're generative of closing alternatives. And that's because there's a lot of strong emotions, particularly in the context of conflict. So we need to understand that we don't, as people, have the free will to just get up one day and start telling a different story. We technically, I believe we do, but it's not likely. That's what I'm trying to say. So all of this is to try to give you the bad news that these master narratives, these big stories, are extremely resistant to change, and particularly in the context of conflict, and particularly in the context of very high emotion, very strong emotions. Can I have a next slide? So I wanted to go back to the point I was making earlier, which is about that little gear of characters, right? I think the big important thing we need to pay attention to is the way in which narratives denigrate, that conflict narratives actually denigrate folks. And, and this, I believe, is the heart of the problem. And in which case, if we can begin to think about focus on the way in which characters and stories are portrayed, and we can think about evolving that somewhat, I think we can open up some of these stories into a positive, in a better direction, do some conflict resolution. Can I have a next slide? I've already mentioned the fact that the more the stories are told, the more simplistic the plot lines, the more negative the positioning of the other people, and the more simplistic the value system becomes over time. That's, one of our problems. Can I have the next slide? Now, the alternative is to this sort of closure, this narrative closure that I've been describing. The alternative is complexity, right? And what we want is some messy plots. We want not a clear logical sequence. We want things in that plot line that don't kind of fit the main storyline. We want new values to be integrated into it. We want, instead of just security, Israel only talking about security, what other kinds of values could be integrated into that conversation they're having with and about the Palestinians? And then we want also some negative and positive positions for folks. It'd be wonderful. And Sheila and I know each other, so I could tell her, this is the way I think I've fallen short as a faculty person, or this is how I wish I had been a better mother. Or so I'd be happy to talk about myself to her in both positive and negative terms. But as I said, we're not in a conflict. But even in the context of conflict, I think we can, as practitioners, work to make richer descriptions of people and support their descriptions of themselves in both negative and positive lights. So I think we want something a lot messier than conflicts master narratives present us. Can I have the next slide? Okay, and here's here's the alternative. And again, going back to Giles Deleuze, he talks about, and John Winslade, my friend John Winslade, talked about lines of flight, right? So if you've got lines of force and that's the problem, well, the alternative is a line of flight where you can actually escape velocity, the orbit of these master narratives. And this is just a picture of birds in flight. And what they do when they do this is actually called murmuring. That's the word for this, which is just beautiful in English, murmuring. And what they're actually doing is responding to the folks around them. They're not worried whether the entire flock, what the entire flock is going to do. They're responding to the locality of the adjacent birds, or fish do the same, right? And it's called murmuring. So it started to think about intervention as murmuring, as conflict intervention is a process of murmuring, which I thought was just delightful. Can I have the next slide? So let's talk about how one of the things that could be done, because there's a whole lot of, really good narrative strategies for intervention or narrative approaches for intervention. But I want to tell you about this one that I just started playing with about a year and a half ago. A guy named Shinhov wrote a paper about discourse coalitions in elections in Israel. And he noticed that people are voting, no surprise, in line with narratives that are proximate to their own. And I thought, well, of course, right? That there's some kind of proximity between Mandami, who got elected last night in New York City as mayor, the story that he's telling about what he wants to do and who he is. And there's some kind of proximity that people experience between how they see themselves and the world around them and the story he's telling. Well, that sort of sounds like at one level, of course, But I started thinking more closely about it and thinking, well, wouldn't that be interesting if working with intra-parties that I could not just reproduce the story people are telling, but begin to build a proximate narrative, a story that's not the same, but adjacent, basically. And that would go back, then you could think about maybe introducing some new elements. So what I started to think about was the field of meaning, right? And so if meaning is if the field of meaning is it's a discursive field, and each word in that has potential synonyms and antonyms, right, around it, that you could choose words that are kind of proximate to the main word, right? It's not the main word that people are using. It's not the core value they're describing. It may be an adjacent one that's basically like a synonym, but it's different. It's not quite the same. There is some kind of slippage or variation, right? So I started picking these core narratives, core values that people were, building their stories around a core value. And I started thinking about, well, what would be some synonyms for that word? And then in the course of talking to him, I would sort of build out these synonyms and then develop them a little bit in the conversation with people. And of course, all that is after joining them. So I never sit down with somebody and say, okay, you think liberty is really important. Well, let's try this other word. No, I'm spending 15, 20 minutes talking to them about liberty and why it's important and how they came to it and what do they think about it, etc. And in that process of that, of course, folks feel heard. They're telling me what they think, and I'm, elaborating that with them. So, and of course, in the process, footnote, they are presenting themselves in positive ways, and I'm elaborating that with them. So by the time we get to the introduction of any new language, they are, I'm friendly, and the narratives know I'm not out to destroy them or alter them. So there's a little bit less, the narratives are a little less on guard. And the basic point of these new synonyms, these different words, is to open up some new values that then, because it's a system. Can I go back to that slide of the gears, Alex? So this would imply you could do narrative evolution if you change the plot lines, if you support the evolution of plot line, you introduce a new event that people aren't talking about, or you introduce some new value systems, or you come to describe the characters differently. And I've started thinking about the importance of these values because of their centrality in the ground that people stand on to construct themselves as good or bad, or describe themselves as good and the other people as bad. So they're kind of essential from that way. And they're a little less direct than coming straight on at the redescription of the characters themselves, or even just introducing a new plot line. So can you go back to that slide that you were at? And okay, so can I have the next one? So I started just thinking about some questions, right? And these are the questions I've been asking people. So, and they'll tell me, I've been talking largely to left groups in the United States. I had a large project with a group that was an NGO that was trying to put together a whole lot of other NGOs to fight fascism. That was the project, right? In talking to them, they had a set of core values, and one of them was, they believed in democracy. That was sort of a bad word. I never wanted to work with that one because it was too complex. I preferred things like, voice. They talked a lot about that, the importance of voice, being able to be heard, speak and be heard. And that the left would care about that, because the left always cares about, the diversity of the democratic field and people being able to speak what they feel, and, et cetera, the legitimacy of voice and how central it is to democracy. So I started asking these questions about, well, what does voice mean to you? Because people use words that kind of like just pitch them out there, right? Particularly if they're part of a master narrative, they become like almost meaningless and nobody really knows what they mean. So if you ask them, well, what is voice? What does that mean to you? They start answering, and they can tell me when they first cared about it and what happened about that. And another question of, well, why is that important? Why should we value this? And they tell me why they think it's important, and they have a logic and reasons for that, and we can have a conversation about it. And the next question is really about, well, what are the consequences of making our world built around this notion of voice, or our project built around this notion of voice? What's the benefit of that? What would we gain? And then the $64,000 question, which is, what would we lose? What don't we see? What's the shadow side of focusing on voice? Is there a downside? Is there any detriment to us? Do we lose something? And that takes people a while to think of, but all of that is, can you go back to the slide with all the complexity thing? Yeah, it's right here. All of those questions introduce more of these nodes, these little connections between things that fill out the story in ways that are not as simple as a master narrative. So, okay, can you go back for me now, Alex? Okay, now go back to the next one, please. I'll have the next slide. So let's take two big master narratives. One about, and we might say this is the right and the left in the United States, right? Some groups, some big master narratives are about profit and the importance of shareholder benefits, shareholder and profit of the company. And you might talk to them, well, what do you really, what's really important? Why, in order to have profit, or why profit is so important, but what do you do? And they talk to me about efficiency. There might be language of risk management in that. And we can imagine any corporations being able to talk this language really well, right? And then on the other side, usually on the left, we find people interested. In fact, they think profit is a big problem. And we should not be organized around that. And they think we should be organized around community, around connection to each other. And so when I ask them about what's important, well, they'll talk to me about trust and collaboration, those kinds of things, and why those are good. So I can, can I have the next slide then? So I wanted to take these two big stories, one about profit and one about community, and look at some of these synonyms that are circulating. This is from a program. I used a program called Visual Thesaurus, and it makes these really nice designs. So I use that when I'm thinking about language a lot. So if you take this word efficient, right, which is critically important to the whole discourse about profit, you can either you can see that the word competent begins to point in the direction of learning, of development over time. You're not born competent, you develop it over time. And why do you develop competency? How does that work? Oh, you have mentors. Oh, there's other people involved. Oh, people have helped you. Oh, you have community. Oh, you have relationships. So this notion of competency is a doorway to a different kind of conversation than a sort of a mechanistic efficiency. It's really about the relational base on which we learn from, and how we learn and grow, that we become competent. So, and the importance of teamwork and how what builds teams, etc. So the notion of competency is a different kind of conversation than the notion of efficiency. On the downside, you can pick another word from a sort of in the synonym field of meaning, and do the opposite, which is not sort of build it up, but put it down. What is let's take the word cost efficient. I'm talking to somebody about the importance of profit. They begin talking about efficiency, and we end up talking about cost efficient, right? What's the problem? What's the downside of cost efficiency? Is there a downside? And why would we only want to do that? Why is that the most important thing? What would we miss if we only did that? And people can begin to talk about, for instance, the immorality of that at times, right? At cost to the environment or cost to neighborhoods. It's much cheaper to dump trash, that environmental hazards, on the land in landfills, right, than it is to actually bury them properly. And where do they get dumped? In minority neighborhoods, right? So we can start the conversation a little bit around cost efficiency and the upside or downside of that, decentering this notion of efficient. Can I have the next slide? And likewise, if you're talking on the community side, right, I'm talking to left-wingers and they're talking all about the importance of community and trust, right? I can begin to talk about, how do you have this notion, and I picked the word confidence of these in here. You could pick any number of them and start to ask questions about it. And where does that trust come from? And it's not something you're born with. It's not something that just happens. It's built through developing connections with other people and learning about them, right? You have to have your antenna open to actually begin to have confidence, because you have to attend to what's going on around you and what people are doing, etc. So it again is not just an artifact of something, it implies evolution and development over time. And what reduces confidence? You know, where does that, is confidence something that we would want more of? Or, but what do we have to do to get it? So it's a deeper, different conversation than just the sort of blah blah that I often get from left-wing groups who talking about the importance of community and building trust. Can I have the next slide? Same is true with this notion of voice, as I talked about, you know, with talk about these left-wing groups, right? And they want to reduce fascism, but guess what? They are fascist in their reduction of fascism. It just drives me crazy. So I can talk to them about why voice is important, and they give me the whole spiel about diversity and democracy and all this. And then if I decentered that conversation of voice onto the notion of communication, well, you have to, you know, listen to other people. You've got to not just be able to speak your truth. You've got to listen and connect. And that means you have to be kind of open at times to things that you don't want to hear, right? Things that you wouldn't want other people to say. So all of these are all of this is kind of a decentering of the important core values that groups bring, or people that a group is bringing. And I'm having, again, these conversations into our group. Can I have the next slide? This is the same one. So I'll talk with a group on the left, on the right, about the importance of liberty, right? This would be some of my hate groups I was talking to. And they want to talk about liberty as though it's, you know, fell down out of the sky and it's a thing that you have to have and it's good. But really, liberty is about self-determination. And self-determination, in turn, can be not just about myself, but the notion of determine, which is you got to pay attention to what's going on around you. You can't just wake up one day and do whatever the heck you want. That's not self-determination. Self-determination is a kind of an analytic process where you have to think, what's happening now and what does that mean about what direction I think I should go? But it's about what's happening. That's the other part of this. So you can't just make a set of rules and march into the future on those. You've got to be tuned in, basically. Self-determination requires tuning in. So all of these are directions you can see, examples of how conversations can be can decenter some of these core values and become, you know, what I think Shinhab was thinking about when he's talking about proximate narrative. Can I have the next one? So basically, this is kind of like a, you know, increasing the complexity of what are the important conversational nodes? What are we including here in our conversation? How are we talking about something? We're incorporating some new values and developing this proximate narrative. So it ends up being a more complex discursive field, breaking the lines of force, I might add. Can I have the next slide? So I have a little exercise, but let me go to the last slide first, the next slide. But basically, I would say that the critique of this that I would make is that this can be done, and I'm doing this in my, you know, all the time and thinking about it and talking to groups, etc. But that it can be done is great, but it really requires some kind of ongoing conversations, some sort of presence, relationship with folks. You can't just have a, you know, conversation, do approximate narrative, and then go home for lunch. No, it's a sort of a maintained, or some maintenance, requires some maintenance. So I think of this in terms of it requires ongoing conversations. And there's a kind of an incompleteness to it. So I know that people in the field of conflict resolution are kind of desperate to resolve the conflict instead of thinking about evolving it. And if we can just evolve it a little bit in some of the ways that I've been describing, it doesn't solve the conflict. It's not like going to get a peace agreement in the Middle East, but there's a discomfort because of kind of an incompleteness. That's what I would say. It's not like everything's going to get settled. We have to be tolerant of the dis-ease of not having things completed or finished. And I think in my experience working with a group that was putting groups together to reduce fascism, I found a lot of these sort of conversations, developing these proximate narratives, generated all kinds of internal tensions inside of the group. And there were actually a fight broke out between, in the group that hired me, because I started having these proximate narratives with that group and supporting them to have those kind of conversations with other people. And a big fight broke out because the people inside of, there was a sort of a subgroup inside of this group that was adamant to maintain the difference between fascism and democracy. And what they felt, and they told me this, was that my work with them, intra-group work with them, was making it too messy at all. So they didn't want that messiness. So these kind of internal tensions might also be another problem. So I think what we should do now, before we have any kind of exercise or anything, is to try to figure out, what are people's responses to this? What are you thinking? What sort of comments do you have? And then maybe we can do a little exercise that would be, a living exercise with a couple of you, where we're, the three of us, me and the two other people, are kind of in conversation about using approximate narrative. So maybe we can have some time now to open it up, if we could, Alex, to have people raise their hand and think about things and ask questions or anything. And then we can do some.
Feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat or raise your hand. And
Overdue, you have your hand raised.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to listen these ways of looking at the world and ourselves in narrating. I'm a narrative therapist. I had the chance to meet Michael White and also your friend, Sara, who was here from New Zealand and Los Angeles, the area of California for some time in 2014 in Iași, Romania. So we are a group of narrative therapists. I'm also teaching at the university these ways. And I kind of liked the similar ideas that we practitioners in narrative therapy, we try to use zone of proximal development, and also these processes of continuous enriching the stories and populating the stories with multiple stories and allowing people to have this narrative agency to choose and mold their present ideas and definitions of themselves and relationships into alternative ways. So it was just a pleasure. Thank you.
Can I ask a question to you? Can I ask you a question? So when I listen to you comment, one of the things that, first, I appreciate your comment. Thank you so much. And you accented, I heard, that people get to, design their own stories and have agency, narrative agency, you said, right? But I guess my question to you is, in your own work and your practice, do you worry or stress about the way in which these stories capture people? In other words, do we have the kind of agency, or let's say, are the narratives themselves, do we have to worry about their capacity to restrict and regulate what it is that we can do? How much narrative agency do we have, is another way to ask the question.
I think the question you ask relates to the idea of free will. Do we have free will, and how we can engender and support that manifestation? And I think I'm using to look at the narrative identity and narrative action, the landscape action, landscape identity ideas of Michael White. And I'm thinking that this narrative space where we can engage with creation of narratives, responding to narratives, embracing narratives, and being led by narratives, this space of narrative development is it's like a new dimension that we can operate with, and it can link our understandings and meanings about ourselves and groups, of course, and families and communities, and the actions we have, and that means actions, not only behavior. That I mean, like emotions we feel, or convictions that we held in the end. So, I think that is a unique spot, or a unique area that we are working in as narratives.
I think it's very nice, and it sounds very constructive and wonderful, actually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Celia.
Hi, Sarah. Good to be here with you. And
Nice.
I call it my hyperlinked brain. It's that net that you were showing. So
Yeah.
many thoughts are buzzing. And so I'm just going to name a few and then link it as we talk. One is, I often say, I'm a family therapist, couples and family therapist, and I teach. And so that's my background and train all of that stuff. But I say to my students, words are windows into worlds.
Yes.
I'm struck by this process that you're outlining and how we can enter into their worlds. And with that honor and this notion, I saw somebody say how do we do it with safety, and I think you talked about the relational piece of getting to know them, right? But that there's a lot of honoring of that and that I hear that in the way you're talking about it. A lot of good work to be continued. So thank you.
Well, I think that the question of safety that you raise, and I see it also in the chat, is really important. And I would, you know, occasionally over the course of my life, I've screwed up, right? And sort of jump over the process that people need to have in order to develop a relationship where folks are comfortable, right? So I don't count myself as perfect at this, but I do think there's some really clear guidelines that we can use around how to generate the safety that enables the development of proximate narratives. And it's just about elaborating. It's about elaborating the conditions, the using the language, but also appreciating what people are trying to do in telling whatever story they're telling. And largely it's about positioning themselves as positive. So whatever word or phrase or framework people are using to describe themselves in positive ways, it's easy to then ask questions about that, to develop that. And I think, you know, going back to the prior comment about narrative development, this is just about, it's not about, that's why I don't like reflective listening. Reflective listening is a repetition of the words, which is great. But at one level, it's great. But at another level, what I want to see is how they develop through asking questions about them, through enabling people to attach new plot lines or different kind of people to those phenomena. So it's really about elaborating prior to the development of a whole lot of new language for people. So they have to be comfortable, and basically the narrative has to be comfortable with me and know that I am not a significant risk to its devolution or evolution. And that doesn't mean I have to agree with it. You know, I don't have to sit down in front of hate group people and say, yes, you know, people of color are terrible. I don't have to say that. I just have to listen to what they're using to describe themselves in positive ways and elaborate that. So it's basically legitimizing. That would be my response to that. So any other thoughts or questions?
Simon?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. This is Simon from the Horizons Project. I think
Hi,
we
Simon.
work.
How are you?
It's great, and still working on the narrative engagement across difference. I
That's
mean,
wonderful.
this really, like, I like your whole presentation. Like, it's sort of like sparkling each time I listen to this. But I am sitting with this question around where you talk about narrative, the fragility of narrative evolution. And we're talking about like the internal tensions that arise. So in my practice, dealing with activists who are within this bigger tent where we have power builders and bridge builders, even when we're talking about some of these master narratives and how to sort of like how they evolve and how we have to slow down in working on these issues, we found ourselves teared apart. Even when we're thinking about like building a bigger tent, we found ourselves like we can't build it more because so many there is anger, there are a lot of emotions that come up, there are also a lot of feelings that arise. And at the end, we we tend to lose the bigger picture. So I'm wondering how we sort of like, I know like it will be a long sort of conversation, but how do you deal with those tensions? Because I see them, I feel them, but they have teared us apart. Yeah.
I think you're raising a really important point for all of us, no matter the practice or what context we're in, because the issue is that narratives are quite comfortable when they can control the conditions under which conversations develop. They're happy. They're happy if there's not any kind of threat to them and there's no evolution. So the kind of tensions you describe are ones that happen. Let's go back to this notion of narrative development in the context of narrative development. So once narratives start developing, oh, there's some like, threat to the stability of the lines of force, basically. So I think Simon, one of the things I think we do is jump over in, let's say, in the context of reflective practice, because that's really where this sits, I think. We jump over the need to talk about and through and develop these stories with people. We talk, past that, or we jump over that stage of development, particularly when conflict arises, in order to reach some kind of agreement or come to a common set of goals or make collaborative decisions together, things like that. So there's sort of if you look at the old school social science on group process, you find, what is it? Joining, what is it? Norming, storming, what is it? How's that go?
Mhm.
Somebody tell me, Sheila.
Yeah, I can't remember it. Sorry. I mean, I know what you're talking about.
There was a 4-step process.
I think you got it, Sara. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's about people come together and then they join and everything's happy. And then differences start to appear. And then there's a lot of what was called storming, right? And then once the storming, is in a big swirl, the research shows people began to set out norms. Well, what about if we did that? This is how we should talk to each other, and this is the way we should operate, and this is the kind of way we should do our meetings or whatever. They set out some norms, and then they can collaborate. So at some level, Simon, I think we're kind of we're always backing away from the kind of uproar that happens when groups have to try to sort through. Once the discursive environment is more complex, folks get anxious. And so the question then is how to, or not, let's say narratives get anxious and start to, pull us back to the lines of force where we're all, kind of comfortable. Anyway, that's what I think. We jump over the necessity for living through those storms, and because that's part of everything. And so one could say, if you're a leader of that group, oh, great, this is a mess. I'm so happy about this, right? And why do we need to get here, and what can we do in the middle of this messiness, and et cetera. So I think we back away from it, and we shouldn't. That's my point. But I'm sympathetic, because lots of times you might be the one saying, Simon, oh, this is wonderful. I'm so glad we're having all these differences. I'm learning so much. Meanwhile, somebody wants to leave the group, or a section of the group wants to leave because they're fed up and they've had it. So one of the things that I do with intra-group work always is tell them, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you get to a 7 of upset, 1 is I'm totally happy, everything's fine. 5 is it's not getting so good, and 10 is really horrible. I can't stand this. So I can't. I would always want to know as a facilitator when we're at a 7, and people will tell you, when they're at a 7. So how do you manage? This is a basic question about how do you manage the evolution of a group. And I think, if Simon, you would probably benefit, we all would, from going back and reading some of that literature on group process from long ago. And I think it has narrative dimensions to it. It could be really interesting. But thank you so much.
Ashley.
Hi, Sara.
Oh, Ashley, it's so nice to see you.
Nice
Look
to
at
see you
you.
too.
Great.
I have a I guess like a two-part question. And it's more into like how you structure when you're talking with these groups. So I'm curious as to like how long you wait until you start doing that core value question process. Like you said, like 15 to 20 minutes or so something like that. But like
Yeah.
like, is that 15 to 20 minutes after an initial conversation, or is that, after meeting and getting to know a person? Like, I guess kind of that timeline. And then on top of that, when you're working with a group, I'm curious as to like, I guess what you just said, like on group dynamics and how it maybe hinders some people wanting to step forward, like those lines of force being at play while you're having those conversations with that group, and like if it makes them feel less comfortable talking, and like maybe how you manage that when you're talking to people, like if you do just one-on-one or like speaking to a whole group, things like that.
Well, I think that the smaller the group, the easier it is, right? When you've got like you're talking to 3 or 4 people or even one person, it's a piece of cake, right? So the interviews that I did for the hate groups, they were one-on-one on the phone, and so it was much easier to navigate, and they didn't have other people listening to their responses, right? So they could say things with me that they might not have said in front of others. So I think that the context matters, and with larger groups, right, facilitating larger groups, then there's always the risk of my supporting the evolution of a story, right, in this way, by adding some new words and some new language and making a little bit more connections, etc. And then have people in the room who haven't said a word, and I don't know what they're thinking, began to say, this is too far. This is going too much. We're off topic. We have to go back to think about these important things, and this is why we're here, and blah, blah, blah. So I believe that we're now talking about good facilitation, right? Talking about narrative facilitation, actually. And I think there's some really interesting questions, actually, that would be important for us to try to, almost a protocol for good facilitation that might include a question to a group. I'm busy talking to people, and we're moving along, and then maybe the question of, okay, as a facilitator, we've been talking now for about 20 minutes and 30 minutes about this, and it seems like we're reaching some really interesting new territories, or evolving this, and we're coming up with some good ideas. And probably there's some people in the room who are not enjoying this conversation, who don't think it's a good conversation. And I'd like for us to wonder together about what it is that they might be thinking. And I haven't asked anybody who in the room hates this conversation, but I can open a conversation about what's problematic about the conversation. So I don't think we've had a lot of, actually, I think your question, and Simon's too, is raising, what do we know about narrative facilitation? And we should have an entire, rich body of work about how do we facilitate from a narrative lens, given the dynamics of narratives that are in the room, and how narratives operate. I don't think we've got, somebody has to write a book on this. It's not going to be me. Maybe it'll be Sheila, right?
Ken, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So I wanted to go back to the social function of these narratives, because it seems to me, talking with some friends who have worked with Palestinian and Israeli youth,
Right,
that you can generate and facilitate conversations which can become highly effective in terms of bonding, because you're situated in a space in which bonding is invited. But once you leave that room, you're in another space with other bonds, and you cannot repeat what you said within the facilitated space back in your home territory, because you have another relationship there. And if you violate that relationship, as you say, you're kind of out of the club. So how what thought do you give to how one can extend the impact of these kinds of conversations so that they actually do some work in a longer run? And I refer you back to what you said earlier about many of these agreements that we make in peace negotiations don't actually last.
Right.
Because everything we say is spongy by analogy.
Let me deepen the problem, and then I'll try to give you some thoughts, Ken. And not that the problem needs deepening because it's already deep the way you described it. But I was recently, I've been working with a guy who's designing for the UN. He's designing a manual for facilitators
Yep.
that are facilitating climate negotiations and the big climate meetings. And they're very formulaic right now. That, you know, country A gives their perspective and, you know, pontificates on what they think should happen, and then there's no discussion, and then country B does it, and then there's no discussion. So it's horrible design process. And so he asked me to help him think about, you know, what should be in this manual and how should it work, right? And it's kind of another version of the same question that you're raising, because when you're doing intra-party work, and you could meet with the different countries, you know, in the case of you could meet with the Palestinians prior to any conversations they might have with the Israelis or even other Palestinian groups, and enrich a narrative that has no capacity to live outside of that territory, right? This is, I believe, a version of the question you're asking. Then it seems like to me a good idea to ask the people, what of this conversation would be good to preserve or to raise or to, let's say, give it some oxygen, and what other context? So I have in the past asked people to tell me where the conversation could, you know, find some oxygen. And at that point, you know, at this point we're sort of ending the conversation, and then the question about where it might be able to survive, what kind of places could it survive, and have them talk about that. And maybe it's other groups inside of their own group. Maybe it's not an inter-party, you know, moment there. You know, and I did that with a Palestinian group. And I think it was in 2015 or 2016, something like that, long time ago, 10 years ago now. And went in and, you know, listened to the narrative. It's like 2.5 hours of tirade on the part of this was a group affiliated with the Palestinian Authority, and 2.5 hours of tirade to make sure that I understood all this. And I spent all of my time elaborating, you know, why elaborating their stories about how they were victimized and what was wrong and bad, etc. And then the conversation began to shift something. We started to talk about water, and a lot of the water became the location for, you know, all the signs of inequality and injustice and violation and victimization. And then the question became, who else could be part of the conversation about water? And they thought of other people in the territories and other divisions and groups and etc. So when I left, this was, you know, I didn't have that conversation with them after that. When I left, they were planning another meeting, and they wanted to raise the issues that had sort of evolved to not just we're victims, but we're victims in this context of water, and maybe there's some things we could do. And then the question became, like, who could we do that with and how? That's one interesting evolution that may be just about about making a discrete manifestation of something like water instead of the whole of victimization. And then planning and designing where that could go. And the other example I have it was really fun. I got invited to the Knesset, and they set all the peace and reconciliation groups up for me so I could meet everybody that was part of the peace community, you know, in Israel. And all of these groups came out, the foundations and everybody, you know, the room was pretty big. I mean, it wasn't the big Knesset hall. It was a meeting in the Knesset meeting room. And were like 25, 30 groups there. And so everybody went around and introduced themselves. And then after they finished, I said, oh, this is so nice. I'm so happy to meet everybody. Who wasn't invited? And they were like shocked, and then they started laughing, and then they started naming what groups there might be groups that weren't invited, but they couldn't invite them because of XYZ. So we had this long conversation, but I think the answer, that was an example to me, Ken, of a way in which a conversation can take place that may have implications beyond the room or beyond the event. In the second case, where I was interested in how they could then, and that's what we've started talking about, how they could then incorporate these other groups and build those connections with them. So the conversation sort of jumped to the meta level, not just about what they're doing, but about what these other groups were doing, and how the peace community itself was fractured and what they might want to do about that. So again, they're not terribly good examples, because neither one of them are cases where I stuck around, or I could stick around. I would have, if I could have stuck around for those. So there may be some design issues that we could think about.
Yeah, I would think, I mean, you've gone a long way with the facilitation process, but it's the bridging process that I think that could really stand some
Yeah, I agree.
because you raised a couple of possibilities. I could imagine some others, but we could flesh out that would be really nice.
And the bridging may be, it may be a protocol of some kind, intra-group protocol, working with a group about under what conditions and in what way, and how would that work, and who would do it, etc. There are there's groups in, I know people that are doing climate mitigation work in communities, sea level rise, and it's raising all kinds of issues around minority groups that have been traditionally marginalized, and who counts as a member of the community, basically. So a lot of the work is about enabling the group to rethink what it is, who the group is and how they got to be a group, and who gets left out, and then what are you going to do about redressing that. And the groups are planning, the groups are designing that. So it may be protocol. It may be just a good set of questions that we work groups through that would enable them to get to the point where they can do that kind of bridging. Good question.
I think Lois Holtzman's got something in the chat that responds to that too. Yeah. It's just that working with guerrillas and militias in Colombia.
Yes, yes, they've done an excellent job. They've done an excellent job on that, right?
Yeah,
super good, wonderful. Well, we've got about 15 minutes. Do you want to? We're sort of running out of time to practice. We could keep on having some questions. If somebody wants to do a practice, I'm happy to do that. But I'm sort of thinking we're kind of talking generically now at this point rather than technically. So what's the group's pleasure? You want to keep on with some questions and comments? Oh, they want the exercise. Okay. So is it Ovidiu? Is that how you say it?
Yes, Ovidiu, after the Latin poet's name, Ovid.
Oh, it's lovely. It's lovely. So Ovidiu, what about if you and I do this?
Yes.
You want to? Let's do it, okay?
Yeah.
So why don't you occupy yourself in a narrative that is that anchors a conflict that you know about, may not be yours, maybe somebody else's, and let's see what we can do here. You want to do the role play?
Absolutely, yes.
Great. All right, so go for it. Why don't you tell me this story here?
Well, I was considering very fast if it will be a conflict from Romania or it will be a conflict that you all know. So I was wondering about it. I'm choosing something. Okay. I'm choosing something local. Yeah, okay. Something local. And it is about our relationship with our minority, which is more salient, which is the Roma community that we have some left behind in Romania. Most of them, they are migrating in other economically wealthier countries in Europe, but we still have an important number of minority here in Romania. And one
Okay.
of the conflicts that I see is that we get these conflictual reportings about some of their life in camps or involved in different anti-social acts. And then we, the representatives of the Romanian ethnic group, they say they are not representing us, why they are so much in the Western media. So this is like a media funneled, let's say so, reaction of the majority against the not so nice representation in the eyes of European community.
Okay. And where are you with this? Oh, with you.
Oh,
Oh,
I had the chance to meet everybody in this, so I am there really curious to learn about the locality of each situation and learning about how each party is constructing this view. So I'm
okay.
not keeping aside, but I'm just aware of this conflict, which is sometimes discussed even casually in some meetings. So
And,
it goes like that.
you don't have a side?
Well, I
Well,
have to tell you that my mom had a side. My mom had a very clear side, and she said,
let's
I don't trust the gypsies." That was her saying.
all righty. So this may be, it may be, let's be, can you be your mom?
Oh, it can be my mom. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. Okay. So tell me a little bit about, and the reason I'm doing this, folks, is because he's already outside, right? He's outside. So he's not attached to the conflict the way we would want somebody to. When you're in a, working with a group, they've got some kind of stake in it. They're upset about something. They've got a problem. So it's one thing to speak in the abstract about this. It's another thing to be from within. And so I'm asking him to get in. So he's in with his mom. Okay. Tell me a little bit about, this, how you see this situation.
Living in a poor village, not far away from the big city of Yash, living in a family with 7 kids in the time after communists just kicked in, so the parents were stripped of their benefits and land and everything. Um, I saw me, Adriana, the mother. I saw the inequities or the way that some people are benefiting from what other people work. And I lived in a family where my father was very strict, and he educated very strongly that we have to be correct. So equity and correctitude is a very important value that I have, and I cannot stand when anybody will try to steal or misplace something and not take responsibility for it.
Okay. Okay. So if we back, this is fabulous. So if we back up and we listen to the story, we've got a couple of core values, and he handed them to us on a platter there, about equity, right? And correctitude, he said, which is really about, the 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 importance of, these are values related to the importance of benefiting from your work, but working, right? These are values that say, look, nobody handed us this. So, we put our time and energy and our own intelligence and our blood into this, our time and life. And we don't want we didn't do this to benefit other people. We did it to benefit, and it shouldn't be taken away from us. So it's as much about the importance of hard work, I would say. This is another value that's in there. So I might build a narrative I might do approximate narrative here about hard working. It's not exactly the same story about equity and correctitude, but I would like to hear more about hard work. So I'm going to ask a question. I've listened to this and said, this sounds like this must have been a very difficult time that you lived through. I can't even imagine it. And I don't know what, enabled you to keep going when times got so hard. And I was just curious about, you know, who taught you the importance of hard work, of working hard, of getting through a difficult time by working hard. Who taught you that? Or where did that come from?
If I'm getting back into the role, my father was the one who actually showed us, the children were growing up to the moment I was 17 when he died of heart failure, while he was fighting for his rights against the communist agents who were criticizing his former involvement in political parties and before communism. And he always told us, and he always beaten up us to study and learn and study and learn and work diligently. He worked, fight, and died for it. So he is the one that I am mentioning a lot in educating my sons.
Right. And so this is really about, because you mentioned a whole lot of other things that are beyond just working hard, right? You know, about personal sacrifice and being able to do without and taking risks for if it was morally required. So there's a lot going on here. And I kind of wanted to circle back to just working hard, right? And you learned this from your dad. And how did this manifest in your life? You know, how did working hard, you know, how would I have seen it in your life? Not
As
just
soon as I got
but from your life.
as I got married, I had my first son, Ovidio, and then I immediately went into workforce. I had to work, and I brought him to my job, and they allowed me to have him around, and I worked. Always I worked. I never had a vacation with my husband all my life.
Okay.
And
And
working
so,
is the only way to go ahead.
yeah, and it must be, you know, because hard work is the reason work is hard sometimes is because you don't get to do the things you want, right? Right. You have to do things that you don't always want to do every day, all the time. You have to sacrifice and suffer, right? So if I were to ask you to go back and talk and highlight for me some examples of the suffering that you had, what kinds of things would you mention?
The things that I remember most are that I could not be there with members of my family when they needed me most, like my mother who died of cancer. I could not help her enough, or my elder sister who had been hemiplegic, but I could not host her in my house more than 2 years. I had to move her into a hospital for more care, and I always felt guilty that I could not offer them more.
Yeah. And that's really it's and that probably with many other examples there about other people that you couldn't help because those are both examples of people that you loved that you know really couldn't be there for. Was there other kind of suffering? Did you ever go without food or worry about food or having enough to eat?
Yeah.
Did
Well,
you?
there were times when not only me, but other people in not in the middle class, but in the aspiring low class of Romanian workers didn't have enough because society was not providing enough. So there were always um, difficulties of getting basic food sometimes, especially in the 80s when the big
And
communist crisis happened.
and people were not able to provide food for themselves. Why?
There were shortages in what the community, the society was offering. Yeah.
Interesting. So
So
even
we were lucky to have somebody in the rural areas who could provide some of their production, like yeah,
so even in
agriculture.
even in
Yeah,
the even when we consider hard work, there's things that hard work can't solve.
yeah.
You know,
There is some there is a big inequity in that too.
yes,
But what can we do? What can we do?
perfect.
We
Okay,
are
great.
left without options.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So this would be, I would stop this little example and make a comment. First, I'd like to ask you to speak over with you about your experience of the conversation.
So I felt privileged to be invited by you to participate and to enroll into my mother's person or caricature, because I never had the chance in my systemic training to do that, but this is the first time. And I think I was kind of looking at myself, honoring her, and picking up some of the things that she told us during the years.
Right. And as you occupied that role, was there anything that you noticed about the, let's say, the movement of the conversation over time around?
Oh, I felt well understood by you, by the way you phrased, and you took care of the stories, of the storylines and the words that I said. So it felt that you are constituting me as a mother, as the character in this role, and it felt secure. It felt well received, yeah, and not critical in any way. Yeah.
I enjoyed it very much, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight here, at least this is first place, hard work was not something you said.
Mm.
It's a word that I brought, right?
Yeah.
I brought this. I sort of thought,
Yeah, you brought it in. Yeah.
I brought
It
this.
was a liminal thing.
What?
It was a liminal thing. It was a story, contiguous story. Yeah, I loved
That's right.
that.
That's right. It was sort of a side story, but not unrelated, but different. So we started talking about hard work. And then the last thing just said hard work, hard work, hard work. And then I said, oh gosh, there's some kind of, and then we started talking about suffering. And then I said, well, there's some kind of suffering that hard work can't fix. And then you said, yes, that's another kind of inequity. So I saw sort of interesting connections there between what your mother had originally said, which is, these are people that take advantage and, don't do what they're supposed to do. And, it's injustice and all that. And now she's talking about folks, that can't even eat. And it's not even the kind of same, it's a different kind of inequity that she feels. But now she's on the side of people who can't solve their problem through hard work, right? So this is a more complicated narrative that if we had more time, I would have spent more time developing. And then we haven't solved the problem of her approach to these people, to the group, but there is a more complex narrative now in place that she's telling about what's going on and what it was like for her. Is that helpful?
Yeah, we constructed the playground. You constructed a playground where we can hide and seek and discover things. Yeah.
That's a lovely metaphor. Thank you so much. And I appreciate your sharing. It's very nice.
Thank you.
So
It was a privilege.
thank you. Anybody have any other comments here? We've got 2 minutes more. Anything that you'd like to add?
I was thinking as you did that, interesting exercise. What if I were a committed environmentalist? And you get me to see, in fact, really, the people who do anti really have their points, and I don't really. I have a very strong basis to stand on.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd feel happy about that. I mean,
are you talking about if you're a member of the public that doesn't believe in anthropomorphic climate change? I lost the thread here. Who are you?
well, look, if I have a very strong pro-climate position, and I talk with people who say, look, there's no climate problem at all, I'm not willing to give up that position on the basis of logic.
I know. We have I'll finish this with a story. One of our children, Carlos is on this, my husband's on this workshop here, on the webinar, is a climate scientist, fanatic climate scientist, and very, very well known. Her name is Kim Cobb. Yep. And she tortures us all the time and everybody around her with climate related phenomena and solar panels on the house and, electric cars, whole thing. And she had a meeting of 25 other women scientists and at our house here in DC one time. And yep. And I was racing around making vegetarian chili and picking up plates. And as I was running to and from the living room, all these women are in there. And she said, Mom, come in here. And I said, what? She said, Mom, we want to know why science doesn't matter, because they couldn't convince anybody. The science doesn't convince anybody. So, we had a long conversation about how do you ask good questions? what do you find out people care about? And it's not, you know, it's not about the battle of the narrative, whose narrative is going to win. It's about more narratives. That's what I would end with. I would say this is about more complex narratives, additional narratives. I would want to know why you care about what you do care about, what you're worried about, why you're worried about that. What did your mom and dad think about that? Who was your grandmother, and where do you work, and what do your coworkers say, and what would your pastor say? I'd want to know all of that as a field of meaning that you're part of. And it, because the point of this is not a conversation about, you know, who's.
But if you show me all the complexities, I'd give up my activism.
No, you don't give up your activism. You learn, and this is what our daughters had to do. You learn that people come to issues from a variety of different, it's like Ovidew's mother, from a variety of different experiences. And on looking at those experiences and describing them and sort of putting them together in a different way, make a space for people to learn. And so I would anticipate you would be learning, Ken, and I know you would, about how other people see these issues. And if we can't do that kind of learning, and maybe that's what our narrative work is about, is we're supporting learning, we're supporting the development, not only the stories, but enriching the experiences that people have. So I'm on your side with that, definitely, Ken.
I mean, another way of saying that, I think, is that the point of the process that you're describing is not to change someone, and it's also not to come to an agreement. I mean, you said that before. It's not to resolve a problem, but just to complexify things. And in that stew of complexity, there's a little bit of a softening. It's so hard to keep the black and white alive, and you embrace this kind of, wow, there are a lot of different perspectives about this. Yeah, it's a different conversation.
It is, and that's really what our goal could be, is just different conversation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated being here with everybody, and it was a lot of fun to share some ideas and talk about your reactions.
Thank you so much, Sara.
Yeah, thank you, Sara.
Fabulous conversation, really informative, and the group, I thought, has asked some really good questions. So thank you so much.
Smart group. It's really nice. Okay, folks, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you
thank
for
you.
joining us.
Thanks for organizing
you.
this. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.